Hi, I'm John Mancini with Content Results, and I've been doing a lot of work recently with Quality Associates, QAI, in the context of thinking about the implications of the M1921 set of deadlines for transfer of electronic records to NARA. And in that context, I've been talking with Scott Swiderski about some of the issues associated with any digitization project. And so I thought that it might be interesting to have a set of conversations with him and talk about the elements of successful digitization, because I was very impressed with the practical way that they approach these projects. So the first session, we'll talk about this whole question of how do you get started? How do you frame a project to begin with? The second one, we'll talk about how do you price this thing right? And that has dimensions both on the agency side as well as on the vendor side in terms of thinking, in terms of not all projects are alike. The third thing is talk about some of the unique aspects of federal contracting, because as I've learned from a lot of experience with companies and with agencies, it's a very different kettle of fish in the federal government than it is in the private sector. And then the fourth thing is talk about a typical timeline for a project. So I hope you enjoy the series, and I will post links to all of the videos that we've done in this series at the end, and thank you for your time. In previous segments, we've talked about how to get started on a digitization project. We've talked about some of the elements and factors incorporated with costing a project. We've talked about contracting and why federal contracting is somewhat unique from general private sector contracting. And in this last segment, I want to talk about timelines, Scott. I want to talk a little bit about, what's a typical timeline for a project focused on digitization in the federal government space?
Yeah, great question, John. So, timeline is a discussion in and of itself, right? In terms of what and how and where the work's going to take place. So many variables play into how to achieve an agreed upon timeline. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about that. It's obviously a major expectation that has tentacles, right? And it has risk. And without achieving the timeline, or at least the agreed upon timeline, the risk is that the project may go over the scope of what was originally put in place for a budget. It may put at risk, the SLA that was defined based upon a lot of other principles and rules for this information becoming available. So let's talk about that a little bit. There's a lot of things that go into achieving the timeline. I think one of the first areas would be to assess thoroughly, right? And make sure that the people that are in the seats to do the jobs that have been described in the communication plan are the right folks. And there's a lot that goes into looking at, the selection of the equipment, the folks that are doing the assessment work at the agency site. And so what's coming across as material, has it been defined well enough that it matches up with the IT considerations around, the equipment that's intended to do the work. All this has something to do with throughputs, and a good vendor, a good partner will have the capability of getting that right up front. And they'll do that by conducting pilots and conducting proof of concepts and so forth to avoid, surprises, or to at least provide them with the opportunity to scope a lot of those IT decisions correctly. The next thing they'll do is they'll put a great management plan in place, and so they'll keep their staff, tightly defined to what needs to be done on a daily, hourly, and weekly, monthly basis. So all those things will be managed against as key criteria for letting their customers know whether or not they're on track. And if they're not, I think one of the next recommendations would be is, if we're not on track, maybe it's likely that a project in the beginning is a little bit less automated, right? As we're learning, what it is that we need to do. And so therefore we've got to create a plan to do some catch up. And the catch up is because the project started, a little bit slower than what was anticipated in the overall plan. So how does that get put into place? And we can do an extension of time, right? That's one way to close the gap. We can add equipment and add personnel. Those are things that are, I think, the responsibility of the vendor partner, just to add a few. But we also get complications from the federal agency partner side. And in some cases, our clients thought that they'd be ready to provide us with all this material, maybe at once, only to discover that, portions of the material that was in scope cannot go off site for various reasons. And so it slows down the process that the vendor can provide. All that has something to do with, the impact of a timeline. But I think the really important thing too, is we talk about, achieving a timeline and achieving, the agreed upon plan is the communication, right? So inevitably, most of these projects find themselves needing to make adjustments along the way. And, how we go about communicating that, I think is really key. A lot of us today are working virtually. So there's a good chance as well that, the managers of this budget and this plan and this outcome are going to be meeting, John, like you and I are meeting. So, is the vendor capable of accommodating those circumstances while also, right, getting timely information from their production side about what's happening? We don't need any weak delays, right, in reporting, because all that can, stem and become a problem to meeting the timeline. So lots of comprehensive things need to be in place. Lots of experience, needs to be, on the part of the vendor to accommodate all these changes and these roles that require us to pivot, right, and reconsider, right, what the plan might originally have been drawn out to be and what it ultimately becomes, because we've learned things along the way. So, again, those are all areas I think that, put timelines at risk. And quite frankly, it's a lot of things, right? So again, kind of falling back on the consideration of the experience of the partner and the vendor as being so key to keeping a project, on its timeline.
Yeah, it's really funny when I was listening to you talk about some of those issues about, unexpected developments and communications and kind of the importance of staying in touch with each other as a project develops. It really focuses for me on the importance that change management plays in all of this. It's, every single IT project I ever talk to people about, they always underestimate the change aspect. What these things represent is a change in the way that somebody does business. And so thinking about that and making sure that you have that good cooperative, iterative kind of relationship with the customer, I think becomes really, really important, because otherwise nobody can ever anticipate, what kinds of things you're going to run into downstream. And, that ability to reset kind of along the way, I think becomes really important.
Yeah, the avoidance of the scope creep is really a critical area for keeping these projects, on the agreed upon timeline. But inevitably the project will go down the course that it needs to go down in order to achieve the result that we want. And the change management component that you described is just very key to resetting the customer or the client expectations if necessary, or simply making the adjustment to potentially cut something out. I mean, the last thing that we want to do is find ourselves spending more than what the customer can afford. Right. And in certain circumstances, maybe the decision is to do, less volume potentially, or we decide to, downsize the classification and the metadata expectations. And so all these adjustments are all common, and they exist throughout the course of providing this type of service.